Story number 1.
The wind roared like a living beast, and the snow fell so thickly that it swallowed the world whole. Emily gripped the steering wheel of her old Subaru, her knuckles white with tension. The forecast had warned of snow, but nothing like this. The highway had become a labyrinth of blinding white, and her headlights barely illuminated the road ahead. She'd been driving home to her parents' cabin for the holidays, taking a route through the mountains that cut hours off the trip. Now she regretted every shortcut, every minute saved. Her phone had lost service miles back, and her gas gauge was creeping dangerously close to empty. Then, as if the storm itself had decided to toy with her, the engine sputtered and died. The car coasted to a stop, and Emily's heart sank. She sat in silence, listening to the wind batter the car. The cold seeped in quickly, and she realized she didn't have a choice. She had to find shelter. Pulling on her heavy coat, scarf, rake, and gloves, Emily stepped out into the storm. The snow was knee-deep, and the cold cut through her like a blade. She squinted through the blizzard, trying to make out anything in the endless white. Then, faintly, she saw it. A light. She stumbled toward it, her legs already aching from the effort. As she drew closer, the outline of a building emerged from the storm. It was an old house, its wooden siding weathered and its windows frosted over. The light came from a lantern hanging by the door, swinging gently in the wind. Emily banged on the door with frozen fists. "Hello? Is anyone there? I need help." The door creaked open and a woman appeared. She was middle-aged, with sharp eyes and a kind smile. Her gray hair was pulled back into a loose bun, and she wore a thick wool sweater. "You poor thing," the woman said, ushering Emily inside. "Come in before you freeze." The warmth of the house was a shock, and Emily nearly collapsed with relief. The interior was simple but cozy, with a roaring fire in the stone fireplace and a kettle whistling on the stove. The woman guided her to a chair by the fire and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. "What were you doing out in this storm?" the woman asked as she poured Emily a cup of tea. "My car broke down," Emily said, her teeth chattering. "I didn't know where else to go." "Well, you're lucky you found this place," the woman said. "My name's Margaret, by the way." "Emily, thank you for letting me in." Margaret smiled. "Of course, dear. Storms like this can be deadly." As Emily sipped her tea, she glanced around the room. It was quaint, filled with antique furniture and old photographs, but there was something about the place that felt off. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the shadows cast by the fire seemed too dark, too deep. "Do you live here alone?" Emily asked, trying to shake the unease creeping over her. Margaret's smile faltered for a moment. "Yes. My husband passed a few years ago, and my children are grown. It's just me now." The words felt rehearsed, as though Margaret had said them many times before. Emily nodded and tried to focus on warming up. After a while, Margaret showed her to a small guest room upstairs. The bed was covered in a thick quilt, and a single lamp cast a dim glow over the room. Emily thanked her and climbed into bed, exhaustion finally overtaking her. She woke in the middle of the night to a sound. Footsteps. They were soft, deliberate, moving down the hallway outside her room. Emily held her breath, her heart pounding. She told herself it was Margaret, but something about the rhythm of the steps felt wrong. Too slow, too deliberate. The footsteps stopped outside her door. She waited, every muscle in her body tense. After a long moment, she heard the faint creak of the floorboards retreating down the hall. She exhaled shakily, telling herself she was imagining things, but the feeling of unease only grew. The next morning, Margaret greeted her with a warm breakfast and a cheerful demeanor, as if nothing had happened. Emily didn't mention the footsteps, unsure if she was being paranoid. "I think I'll head out as soon as the storm lets up," Emily said, trying to sound casual. Margaret's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, the roads will be too dangerous for days. You should stay here where it's safe." Something about the way she said it sent a chill down Emily's spine. She nodded politely, but her mind raced. She needed to leave, storm or no storm. That afternoon, while Margaret was busy in the kitchen, Emily decided to explore the house. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe it was her survival instincts kicking in, but she needed to know why the house felt so wrong. She found herself drawn to a door at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar. Inside was a small room, more of a storage space than anything else. But what caught her attention was the smell, damp and metallic. Her stomach churned as she stepped inside and saw what was on the floor. A pile of old, tattered clothes. Boots, jackets, scarves, all covered in dried, rust-colored stains. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She stumbled back, her mind reeling. She turned to leave the room and nearly screamed when she saw Margaret standing in the doorway. "What are you doing in here?" Margaret asked, her voice low and devoid of its earlier warmth. I got lost," Emily stammered, backing away. Margaret's eyes narrowed, and for the first time Emily saw something beneath her kind facade. Something cold. Something dangerous. "You shouldn't go poking around where you don't belong," Margaret said. Emily nodded quickly and slipped past her, her heart hammering. She had to leave. That night, while Margaret slept, she would sneak out and brave the storm. When night fell, Emily lay awake, listening for any sign of movement. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the wind howling outside. She waited until she was certain Margaret was asleep before creeping out of bed and heading for the door. The house was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the dying fire in the living room. Emily moved as quietly as she could, her boots in her hand to muffle her steps. She reached the front door and slowly turned the knob. It wouldn't budge. Her heart sank. She tried again, but the door was locked tight. She turned to head for a window, but froze when she saw Margaret standing at the top of the stairs, holding a lantern. Her face was shadowed, but her eyes glinted in the dim light. "Where do you think you're going?" Margaret asked, her voice calm but laced with menace. Emily didn't answer. She bolted for the window, throwing her shoulder into it. The glass shattered, and the icy wind rushed in, cutting her like a whip. She climbed out, ignoring the shards slicing into her hands, and ran into the storm. The cold was brutal, but adrenaline kept her moving. She didn't look back, didn't dare to see if Margaret was following. She ran until her legs gave out, like collapsing into the snow. When she woke, it was to the sound of voices. She opened her eyes to see a group of rescue workers surrounding her. They bundled her into a warm blanket and loaded her into a snowcat. "You're lucky we found you," one of them said. "A storm like this can kill in hours." As they drove away, Emily glanced back at the forest. There was no house, no light, just endless, untouched snow. Story. The end.
Story number 2.
The snow began early that afternoon, a soft flurry that blanketed the small Colorado town in a picturesque white glow. By nightfall, the storm had transformed into a full-blown blizzard, the kind that forced everyone indoors, huddling by their fireplaces. Everyone, that is, except Mike Reynolds. Mike wasn't particularly adventurous, but he was stubborn. He was a delivery driver for a regional courier company, and that night he had one last package to deliver, a small box marked with an urgent medical seal. The address was a cabin up in the mountains, miles away from the town's edge. "Don't be stupid, Mike," his supervisor had warned over the phone. "That storm's going to shut the whole mountain down. Deliver it in the morning." But Mike knew how these jobs worked. The package's label screamed importance, and an early delivery could mean a bigger bonus or maybe even a permanent promotion. So, against all advice, he loaded the package into his Jeep and set off into the storm. The first hour was manageable. The roads were icy, but Mike knew the route well, and his Jeep handled the conditions better than most vehicles. As the elevation increased, so did the snow's intensity. The headlights barely cut through the swirling white, and the tires struggled for traction. By the time he reached the forest road that led to the cabin, visibility had dropped to near zero. His phone had lost service, leaving him reliant on a printed map and his memory. He clenched the wheel tightly, muttering under his breath about how stupid this was. The road grew narrower, hemmed in by dense pines heavy with snow. Mike glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was nearly 10 p.m., and he hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour. The world outside was silent, save for the howl of the wind. Then his headlights illuminated something ahead. A figure. Mike's heart leapt as he slammed on the brakes. The Jeep slid to a stop, and for a moment all he could do was stare. The figure was a man, dressed in a thin jacket and jeans, his face pale and his hair dusted with snow. He stood in the middle of the road, one hand raised as if signaling for help. Mike rolled down the window a crack, the cold biting at his face. "Hey, you okay?" The man didn't answer. He just stared at Mike, his eyes wide and unblinking. His lips moved, but whatever he was saying was lost in the wind. Mike hesitated, Everything about this felt wrong. Why would someone be out here, dressed like that, in the middle of a storm? But the man looked desperate, and Mike couldn't just drive away. "Hop in!" Mike shouted, unlocking the passenger door. The man climbed in without a word. Up close, he looked worse. His skin was grayish, his hands trembling violently. He didn't smell like alcohol, but there was something unsettling about his presence. "Where are you headed?" Mike asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man didn't answer. He just stared ahead, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Mike swallowed hard. "Look, I'm headed up to a cabin. I can drop you off somewhere once we're out of the storm, okay?" The man finally turned to him, his eyes glassy. "Don't go to the cabin," Mike frowned. "What?" "Don't go to the cabin," the man repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Mike's grip on the wheel tightened. "Why not?" The man didn't respond. He turned his gaze back to the windshield, staring blankly into the storm. Mike felt a chill creep up his spine, but he shook it off. The guy was probably just delirious from the cold. The road grew worse as they ascended higher into the mountains. The snow piled up in deep drifts, and the Jeep struggled to push through. Mike kept glancing at the man, who hadn't said another word. Then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, the man was gone. Mike slammed on the brakes, the Jeep skidding to a halt. The passenger seat was empty, the door still locked. He whipped his head around, searching the interior, then outside into the swirling snow. There was no sign of footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. "What the hell?" Mike muttered, his breath fogging the air. He was shaking now, fear taking hold. He tried to convince himself that he was just overtired, that the storm was playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew better. Something was very wrong. Still, he pressed on. The address was only a few miles away, and he told himself he'd make the delivery and leave as quickly as possible. The Jeep crawled forward, the cabin's coordinates glowing on the GPS screen. When he finally reached the driveway, the storm seemed to grow quieter, as if muffled by the dense trees surrounding the cabin. The house itself was dark, a hulking shadow against the snow. No lights, no smoke from the chimney. Mike killed the engine and grabbed the package, hesitating before stepping out. The air was unnaturally still, the silence pressing against his ears. He trudged through the snow to the front door and knocked. Nothing. He knocked again, harder this time. "Hello? Delivery!" The door creaked open under the force of his knock. The inside was pitch black, and the air smelled stale, like the place had been abandoned for years. Mike stepped inside, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. "Hello?" A faint noise came from deeper in the house, like a whisper. Mike froze. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to leave the package and go, but his feet moved forward against his better judgment. The whispering grew louder as he approached a door at the end of the hallway. He hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached for the knob. He pushed it open. The room was empty, save for a single chair in the center. The whispering stopped. Mike's breath came in shallow gasps as he stepped back, his mind racing. Then, behind him, the floor creaked. He spun around, but the hallway was empty. The shadows seemed to stretch and writhe, as if alive. Panic overtook him, and he bolted for the front door, dropping the package in his haste. The moment he stepped outside, he stopped. The storm had vanished. The snow was gone. The sky above was clear and filled with stars. But the cabin, it wasn't there. He stood in the middle of the forest, surrounded by trees and silence. His Jeep was gone. The road was gone. There was nothing but the crushing darkness of the woods. A voice whispered in his ear, cold and clear, "I told you not to go to the cabin." Story the end.
Story number 3.
The snowstorm was relentless, a swirling wall of white that consumed the landscape and left the world feeling small and suffocating. Jacob and his sister Anna had planned their trip to their late grandmother's cabin weeks ago. They were eager to sort through her belongings and prepare the property for sale, but the weather had turned far worse than they'd anticipated. The old cabin sat deep in the woods, miles from the nearest neighbor. It was a modest structure, 2 stories with creaking floors and a fireplace that was barely functional. Their grandmother, a fiercely independent woman, had lived there until her death last summer. She'd loved the isolation, but Jacob and Anna found it unnerving, especially in a storm like this. By the time they reached the cabin, the snow was nearly waist deep, and the road had become impassable. The siblings managed to get inside, shivering and brushing snow off their clothes as the wind howled outside. "God, it's freezing in here," Anna said, stomping her boots on the wooden floor. Jacob nodded, his breath visible in the icy air. "Let's get a fire going. We'll have to ride this out until the storm clears." The cabin's generator wasn't reliable, but they managed to get it running. Soon, the dim glow of the overhead lights and the crackling fire in the hearth gave the space a semblance of warmth. They settled in, unpacking supplies and talking about their grandmother's life. "She always said this place was special," Anna said, sipping from a steaming mug of tea. "I never understood why. It's just a cabin in the middle of nowhere." Jacob shrugged. "She liked the quiet, said it helped her think." Anna hesitated, her gaze flickering to the window. "She also said some weird stuff before she passed, remember? About the woods." Jacob snorted. She was old, probably just her imagination. But even as he dismissed it, Jacob felt a prickle of unease. Their grandmother had spoken often about the woods, warning them to stay close to the cabin and never venture out after dark. She'd never explained why, and Jacob had always assumed it was just a quirk of hers. But now, surrounded by the storm and the oppressive quiet of the forest, her warnings felt heavier. As night fell, the storm grew fiercer. The wind screamed through the trees, and the windows rattled in their frames. Anna curled up on the couch with a blanket, scrolling through her phone. Jacob stood by the window, peering out into the swirling snow. "That storm doesn't look like it's letting up anytime soon," he said. Anna didn't respond. When Jacob turned, he saw her staring at the window, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Jacob frowned. "Hear what?" "Footsteps." He listened, straining to hear over the wind. For a moment, there was nothing. Then faintly, he heard it, a crunching sound, like boots on snow, moving just outside the cabin. Jacob's pulse quickened. "Probably just an animal," he said, though he didn't believe it. Anna shook her head. "That sounded like a person." Jacob grabbed a flashlight and headed for the door, ignoring Anna's protests. The cold hit him like a slap as he stepped outside. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the swirling snow and the skeletal trees. He scanned the area, his breath fogging in the air. "Hello?" he called. His voice was swallowed by the storm. There was no answer, no movement. But as he turned to go back inside, his flashlight caught something. Footprints. Fresh footprints, leading from the edge of the forest to the cabin. But they stopped abruptly, as though whoever had made them had vanished into thin air. Jacob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He hurried back inside, bolting the door behind him. "There's no one out there," he lied. Anna didn't look convinced, but she didn't press him. They spent the rest of the evening in tense silence, jumping at every creak and groan of the old cabin. The storm showed no sign of abating, and the feeling of isolation grew heavier. Around midnight, the power flickered and went out. The generator had failed. "Great," Anna muttered, lighting a candle. "This just keeps getting better." Jacob tried to fix the generator, but quickly gave up. They decided to bunker down for the night, layering on blankets and huddling near the dying fire. Sleep came fitfully, their nerves too frayed to fully relax. Jacob woke to the sound of knocking. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, more insistent. He sat up, his heart pounding. The sound was coming from the front door. Anna stirred, blinking groggily. "What's that?" "Stay here," Jacob whispered, grabbing the flashlight. He crept to the door, the knocking growing louder with each step. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. "Who's there?" he called. The knocking stopped. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. He waited, the silence stretching unbearably. Then a voice, a low, raspy whisper, came from the other side of the door. "Let me in." Jacob's blood ran cold. The voice didn't sound quite human. It was distorted, as though coming from deep within a cavern. He backed away from the door. "Who are you?" he demanded. The voice came again, softer this time, almost pleading. "Let me in. It's so cold." Jacob shook his head, panic rising. "Go away." The knocking resumed, louder and more frantic. The door rattled on its hinges and Jacob stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. "Jacob, what's going on?" Anna's voice was panicked now as she joined him. The knocking stopped abruptly. They stood in silence, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. But the voice didn't come again, and the storm raged on outside. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and sleeplessness. When dawn finally broke, the storm had calmed, leaving a heavy blanket of snow over the landscape. Jacob and Anna decided to leave the cabin, abandoning their plans to sort through their grandmother's belongings. They packed quickly, neither of them speaking about the events of the night before. As they stepped outside, Jacob froze. The fresh snow was unbroken. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. Anna noticed it too. How? Jacob didn't answer. He didn't want to think about it. They trudged through the snow to their car, desperate to leave. But as they drove away, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. When he glanced in the rearview mirror, he thought he saw something. A figure standing in the doorway of the cabin, watching them leave. He didn't look back again. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The snowstorm had started earlier than expected, blanketing the remote Montana countryside in a thick, unrelenting fury. Lisa and her fiancé Mark were on their way to a secluded Airbnb cabin for what was supposed to be a romantic weekend away. It was tucked deep in the woods, advertised as a cozy escape from the modern world. The idea had sounded perfect when they booked it 2 months ago. Now, as the snow piled up and the visibility dropped to near zero, Lisa wasn't so sure. "This is ridiculous," Lisa muttered, gripping the door handle as Mark fought to keep the SUV steady on the icy, narrow road. "We're almost there," Mark said, squinting at the GPS. "Just a couple more miles." The cabin was located off a barely maintained road, a winding path flanked by towering pines weighed down with snow. By the time they finally reached it, the storm was howling, and the world outside the car felt like another planet. Mark parked as close to the front porch as he could manage, and the two of them hurried inside, dragging their luggage through knee-deep snow. The cabin was as advertised, small but charming, with rustic wooden furniture and a stone fireplace. It smelled faintly of pine and cedar, as if someone had gone to great lengths to make it feel welcoming. Lisa couldn't help but feel a little better as the fire crackled to life and the chill of the storm began to fade from her bones. "This isn't so bad," Mark said, grinning as he opened a bottle of wine. Lisa nodded, curling up on the couch with a blanket. "Yeah, it's nice, as long as we don't lose power." The words hung in the air, and both of them glanced at the single overhead light that flickered faintly, as if in warning. Hours passed, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. The wind howled against the cabin, rattling the windows. Lisa tried to focus on the book she'd brought, but her mind kept wandering. Something about the storm felt off, too loud, too unnatural. At around 9 p.m., Mark excused himself to use the bathroom. Lisa sat alone in the living room, the fire casting flickering shadows across the walls. She was about to pour herself another glass of wine when she heard it, a soft knock at the door. Her heart jumped. She froze, listening. Maybe it was the wind, but then it came again, louder this time, a distinct, deliberate knock. "Mark?" she called, her voice trembling. "What?" he shouted back from the bathroom. Lisa stood, her legs unsteady as she approached the door. She peered through the peephole, but all she could see was darkness and swirling snow. "Who's there?" she called. No answer. She hesitated, every instinct telling her not to open the door. But then the knock came again, more insistent. Against her better judgment, she unlatched the lock and opened the door just a crack. No one was there. Lisa's breath clouded in the icy air as she looked out into the storm. There were no footprints in the snow, no sign that anyone had been there at all. "Mark?" she shouted, slamming the door shut. Mark emerged from the bathroom, frowning. "What's going on?" "There was someone at the door," Lisa said, her voice shaking, "but there's no one there." Mark walked over to the door, peering out through the peephole. "It's probably just the wind, Lisa, or an animal." "Animals don't knock," she snapped. Mark sighed and pulled on his jacket. "I'll check outside." "Are you crazy? Don't go out there." But Mark was already opening the door, stepping out into the storm with a flashlight. Lisa stood in the doorway, clutching the blanket around her shoulders as she watched him circle the cabin. The light bobbed in the darkness, illuminating the snow-covered trees. After a few minutes, he returned, brushing snow off his sleeves. "Nothing," he said. "No tracks, no signs of anyone. It's just the storm messing with us." Lisa didn't feel reassured, but she nodded, not wanting to argue. They locked the door and tried to settle back into their evening, but the tension lingered. It was close to midnight when it happened again. A knock, louder this time. 3 deliberate bangs, followed by a long silence. Mark grabbed a fire poker and marched to the door. "If this is some local messing with us..." "Don't open it," Lisa pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. The knock came again, and this time a voice accompanied it. A woman's voice, faint and trembling. "Please, help me." Lisa's blood ran cold. She exchanged a look with Mark, who looked equally unnerved. "Who's out there?" Mark called. "Please," the voice repeated, closer now. "It's so cold." Lisa backed away from the door, her heart pounding. Something's not right. "Don't open it." Mark hesitated, then tightened his grip on the fire poker. What if it's someone who needs help? But before he could make a decision, the power went out. The cabin was plunged into darkness, the fire the only source of light. "Mark," Lisa's voice was trembling now. "Don't." The voice outside changed. It wasn't pleading anymore. It was laughing, a low, guttural laugh that didn't sound remotely human. Mark stepped back from the door, his face pale. "What the hell is that?" The laughter stopped, replaced by silence. And then the knocking started again, faster and more frantic, as though someone or something was trying to break down the door. Lisa screamed, and Mark pulled her away from the door. The sound was deafening, the door rattling on its hinges. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. They stood in the middle of the living room, clutching each other, their breaths coming in panicked gasps. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, the wind howling like a living thing. "Is it gone?" Lisa whispered. Mark didn't answer. He grabbed his phone and tried to call for help, but there was no signal. The storm had cut them off completely. For the rest of the night, they sat by the fire, too terrified to move. The knocking didn't return, but the oppressive feeling of being watched never left. Lisa swore she saw shadows moving outside the windows, shapes that didn't belong to the trees. When dawn finally broke, the storm had calmed. They packed their things in record time and bolted to the SUV. As they drove away, Lisa glanced back at the cabin one last time. She froze. A figure stood in the window, watching them. Its face was pale, its eyes hollow and black. It raised a hand in a slow, deliberate wave. Lisa turned away, her stomach churning. They didn't stop driving until they were miles away from the cabin. They never spoke of the trip again. But sometimes, late at night, Lisa would hear knocking at her apartment door. She never opened it. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The snowstorm had come out of nowhere. What had started as a light flurry around noon quickly transformed into a blinding blizzard by late afternoon. Sarah, a traveling nurse, had been making her way to her family's cabin in the mountains after finishing a long shift at the hospital. She had promised her parents she'd spend the weekend there to unwind before the next grueling week of work. Her phone's GPS warned of poor signal, but she knew the roads to the cabin well enough, or so she thought. The snowfall was so dense that it swallowed the road ahead of her, leaving her headlights to reflect nothing but a swirling white void. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles pale. The forest on either side of the road was pitch black, the towering pine trees barely visible through the storm. It wasn't long before her tires lost traction, and the car slid dangerously close to the edge of the narrow mountain road. With her heart racing, she decided to pull over. "This is insane," Sarah muttered, checking her phone again. No service. She cursed under her breath. She sat in the car for a few minutes, weighing her options. The cabin was only about a mile away, at least she thought it was, but there was no way to be sure in this weather. Staying in the car was safer, but it offered no real protection if the storm worsened. She made up her mind. She'd grab her backpack, flashlight, and emergency blanket, then hike the rest of the way to the cabin. Bundling up against the cold, she stepped out into the snow. The wind was brutal, cutting through her layers and stinging her face. She aimed her flashlight ahead, the beam barely penetrating the blizzard. The forest loomed on either side, silent except for the howling wind. As she trudged through the snow, the feeling of isolation settled over her like a heavy blanket. Every step was an effort, her boots sinking into the deep snow. The path to the cabin should have been straightforward, but the storm disoriented her. The trees all looked the same, and she began to wonder if she had veered off course. After what felt like an eternity, she stopped to catch her breath. The wind howled through the trees, and for a moment, It almost sounded like a voice, high and faint, carried on the wind. She turned, her flashlight sweeping the woods. Nothing. Just shadows and snow. You're imagining things, she told herself. But she quickened her pace, her heart pounding harder with every step. The snow seemed to absorb all sound, making the forest unnervingly quiet. It wasn't until she heard the crunch of footsteps behind her that she stopped dead in her tracks. Sarah spun around, the flashlight shaking in her hand. "Hello?" she called, her voice swallowed by the storm. No answer. The trees swayed in the wind, their skeletal branches reaching out like claws. She strained her ears, listening. The footsteps had stopped. Had it just been an echo of her own steps? She tried to convince herself it was, but fear was beginning to take hold. Turning back toward what she hoped was the direction of the cabin, Sarah pushed forward. The wind bit harder, and the snow seemed to grow heavier, as if the storm were deliberately trying to bury her. She glanced over her shoulder more than once, certain she was being followed, but each time she saw nothing. Then she saw it, a light flickering through the trees. Relief flooded her. The cabin. She must have been closer than she thought. She hurried toward it, stumbling through the snowdrifts. The light grew brighter as she approached, and soon she could make out the outline of the cabin, its windows glowing warmly against the storm. Reaching the porch, she felt an overwhelming sense of safety. She knocked on the door, just in case her parents had arrived early, but there was no response. With trembling hands, she pulled out the spare key hidden in the flower pot and unlocked the door. Inside, the cabin was dark and cold. The glow she'd seen from outside was gone. Confused, Sarah checked the light switches, but nothing happened. The power must have gone out. She closed the door behind her, bolting it for good measure. Using her flashlight, she found the woodpile near the fireplace and managed to get a fire going. The warmth was a welcome relief, but the sense of unease didn't leave her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As she moved around the cabin, checking the windows and making sure they were locked, she noticed something odd. There were wet footprints on the floor, large, heavy prints that didn't match her own. They led from the back door, through the kitchen and into the living room, where they stopped abruptly. Sarah's stomach dropped. She hadn't been imagining the footsteps in the woods. Someone had been here. Her first instinct was to grab her phone and call for help, but there was still no signal. She grabbed the fire poker, her hands trembling as she searched the cabin. Every creak of the floorboards made her jump. Every shadow seemed to move. But the cabin was empty, or at least it appeared to be. Trying to calm herself, she sat by the fire, clutching the poker like a lifeline. The storm continued to rage outside, the wind howling like a living thing. She told herself that whoever had been in the cabin was gone now. Maybe a hiker seeking shelter? But deep down, she didn't believe it. Hours passed, and Sarah fought to stay awake. She was terrified of what might happen if she let her guard down. But exhaustion eventually won, and she drifted off, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. She woke to the sound of knocking. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind, but it grew louder, more insistent. Her heart raced as she sat up, gripping the fire poker. The knocking came from the front door. "Who's there?" she called, her voice shaking. No answer. Just the knocking, rhythmic and relentless. She stood, her legs unsteady, and crept toward the door. The fire poker felt heavy in her hand. "I'm armed," she warned. "I'll call the police." The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then from outside, a voice, a man's voice, deep and raspy. "Let me in," it said. Sarah froze. The voice sounded off, as if it didn't belong to a real person. It was flat, emotionless. "Go away," she shouted. The voice came again, closer this time. "Let me in. It's cold." Her grip tightened on the poker. She backed away from the door, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The doorknob rattled, and the knocking resumed, louder and more frantic. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Sarah didn't move. She stood there, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. The storm outside seemed to quiet, as if holding its breath. Then she heard it, a whisper, so close it felt like it was right behind her. "Let me in." She spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When morning finally came, the storm had cleared, leaving the world outside blanketed in pristine, untouched snow. Gathering her things, she stepped outside, desperate to leave the cabin behind. As she trudged back toward her car, she stopped in her tracks. There were footprints in the snow, large, heavy prints leading from the forest to the cabin. But there were no prints leading away. Story the end.